Olá, bom dia, sejam muito bem-vindos e muito bem-vindas ao terceiro dia do Festival comKids Interativo 2020. Meu nome é Daniel Leite, eu sou o coordenador geral do festival este ano e vou apresentar a primeira atividade desta quinta-feira, que tem muita coisa programada. Inicialmente, nós vamos acompanhar a palestra preparada especialmente para este festival do nosso amigo professor Dr Scot Osterweil, do MIT Game Lab e Education Arcade dos Estados Unidos. Antes de começar o stream da palestra, lembro a vocês que a programação completa do Festival comKids Interativo 2020 vai ficar disponível neste canal do YouTube. E, além disso, você pode acompanhar também muita informação pelas nossas redes sociais, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram e, é claro, no portal comKids, que é esse site especializado na área de comunicação e infância, onde você pode encontrar muita informação a respeito de produção, divulgação de iniciativas culturais para crianças, seja em audiovisual, cultura digital, ou mesmo outras linguagens artísticas, artigos de colunistas, entre outras coisas. Lembro a vocês que após essa transmissão, teremos um bate-papo especial com o professor Scott, contando com a possibilidade de fazer perguntas e ouvir as respostas dele ao vivo, tudo feito aqui via chat do YouTube, ok? Para entrar no bate-papo, vocês vão precisar clicar no link que vai ser enviado aqui no chat do vídeo. Então, vamos lá, vou partir para uma breve apresentação do professor Scott, diretor criativo do Education Arcade e do Game Lab, situado no programa de estudo de mídia comparada do MIT, Estados Unidos. Scot Osterweil desenha games tanto em ambientes acadêmicos como comerciais. Entre os seus projetos estão o aclamado Zumbinis, de matemática e lógica, Vanished, de MIT Smithsonian Game de ciência ambiental, Labyrinth, de matemática, Kids Survey Networks, dados e estatística, e IQ, de história. Fundador e diretor do criativo do Learning Games Network, onde lidera o Gates Foundation Learning Initiative, ESL, onde desenvolveu Quandary, um jogo que foi escolhido como jogo do ano pelo Games for Change 2013. O Scott também é coautor do livro Resonance Games, da MIT Press, e consultor em jogos com a série da Amazon, vencedora do Emmy, chamada Tumble Leaf. Então, vamos iniciar os trabalhos.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here virtually with you in Brazil. I'm Scot Osterweil. I'm the creative director of the MIT Education Arcade. We're a lab at MIT that designs games for learning and develops other educational technology. And it's been my pleasure to visit Brazil several times in the past. Sorry, because of the pandemic, I can't be there now, but I'm with you in spirit. And I'm going to share my screen and show so I can show slides while I talk. Give me one moment, please. So as the slide says, my talk is about how we play, stories, games, and just messing around. It's based on much of the research I do around the ways in which not just children, but in the ways in which we all play. Frequently when I give talks to groups like yours, I start out by asking everybody in the audience to play a quick few rounds of tic-tac-toe. Obviously, we can't do that in this setting, but I can tell you what happens when I do ask people to do this. Almost inevitably, everyone gets very noisy. There's a lot of laughter. There's a lot of joking around. People really get into the game of tic-tac-toe, and they do that in spite of the fact that in fact, tic-tac-toe is a kind of stupid game. Tic-tac-toe is a game that after you're about eight years old, you realize you don't usually win it. And yet when I invite large audiences to play tic-tac-toe, they get quite animated, and it's quite hard for me to get their attention back, which is an interesting feature of the game. And when I remind people that it's a stupid game, they usually laugh and look a little bit embarrassed. But the reality is that there's something very powerful going on when you're given an opportunity to play a game. And of course, the operative word here is play. The power of play is really quite great. I love to share this image. It's a painting from the Renaissance by the great Flemish painter Peter Bruegel, and it's called Children's Games, although in fact it's not just children. You see lots of adults in this painting. But what he was actually doing was documenting over 80 games that were played in Renaissance and medieval Europe at the time. And when you think about the time that he's doing this, they didn't have the same notion of childhood that we have now. A child by the age of 11 was probably working in the family business or on the farm. They were probably married very early in life. There wasn't a sort of a special protected place for much of childhood. And yet what we think of as play and games were just as important to them as they are to us. In fact, games are much older than this. The oldest known game playing pieces in the archaeological record are twice as old as the oldest known writing. So human beings have been playing for far longer than they've been writing. Playing games may be one of the oldest features of human culture. But of course, it's not just humans who play, because it's much older than that. Most of our relatives in the animal kingdom play, even not just vertebrates, even there's some notion that even invertebrates play. And I'm just use two examples from higher order mammals. Mountain goats play a game where they and for the moment here, when I'm saying they play, this is stuff they do when they're not looking for food, when they're not otherwise tending to their survival. Mountain goats will play a game where they chase each other from cliff to cliff and ledge to ledge. And they'll do that even though occasionally a mountain goat will fall to its death. The interesting thing about that is if we know anything about evolution, we know that behaviors that are injurious to individuals tend to die out. But this behavior persists, which suggests that it has benefits that outweigh the risks. And of course, it's very easy for a long time. Scholars concluded that that mountain goats played these games in order to learn the skills they needed. So that sort of the games that mountain goats play, therefore, were just training for their life work. So play in this formulation, play was just training for work. Images like this are quite common on the internet. And when we think about, we've all watched kittens or puppies playing at either fighting or hunting. And it would be easy to conclude, as we did with the mountain goats, that this play was just about training. It was childhood preparation for adult responsibility. But the reality is very different, because they did a study in which they raised kittens and deprived them of opportunities to play with other kittens, to play at all. And those cats grew up knowing how to hunt and how to fight just fine. What they didn't know how to do was how to interact with other cats. And what they didn't know how to do was make decisions. So animal play is about far more complex understanding than just sort of memorization, or just, it's not just about, from the mountain goats, we might think it's about muscle memory, learning how to jump, learning how to land. But in fact, it's not just practice, it's actually about learning how to be in the world. We know from observing children in cultures all around the world that they play the same all over the world. And I think many researchers, myself included, have concluded that in fact, through their play, children are really building very robust models of how the world works. What I love about these images, they're from 4 different continents, and yet you could take a child out of any one of these pictures, move them to another location, and they would fit right in terms of their play. So play is fairly universal. And it really is the way we construct our understanding of the world. I just want to use one personal example of my own from growing up, from before I was even in school, pre-kindergarten. I like to play with wooden blocks. And I can still remember the pleasure of discovering that with the wooden blocks, that 2 square blocks were the same size as 1 rectangular block, and 2 rectangular blocks were the same size as 1 big block, But the real thrilling thing was that that was equal to 4 of the square blocks, and that that relationship of 2 and 2 and 4 could be replicated elsewhere, that I could find other things that had the same relationships. And so at a very early age, I was beginning to understand in a kind of early primitive way that numbers, that mathematics was actually a way we could describe the world, and that it could be intriguing and exciting. And I think it's what led to me to being a good math student. I think it was that play, it was building that robust model of mathematics that I actually did long before I ever went to school, that made me good at math. And we all have examples of things that we engaged with. If you were to spend time sort of interrogating your own past, you discover there are all these things that you engage with through your play that actually helped form the person you are today. In fact, part of what I argue is that in all of our play, there are 4 freedoms present. What I call the 4 freedoms of play. The first of these is the freedom to explore, which is what I was doing with those blocks. I was exploring all their properties. The package of the blocks had pictures of things I could make, but I wasn't just making those things. I was doing my own exploration. Closely related to that is the freedom to fail. If you think about a child, let's stick with blocks for a moment. If you think about a child building a block tower, the interesting learning actually happens when the tower falls down. That's when the child really starts thinking about physics and mechanics. And it's when they start trying harder and harder to build better and better towers. So, and it's that failure that's actually quite common in children's play. In fact, if you watch a child at play, you'll see that they move from failure to failure to failure to failure without feeling any sting of regret. And then they succeed, and then they move on to something harder and start failing again. And it has none of the pain associated with failure that it does in school. Failure is just a normal part of children's play. Freedom of identity is the freedom to imagine ourselves as whoever we want to be. Think for a minute, this happens a lot in doll play. Think about a child playing with Star Wars action figures, and Luke Skywalker's in this hand and Darth Vader's in this hand, and they're fighting with each other. At that moment, for the child, she is thinking about herself both as Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader. She's exploring the ways in which she feels heroic and powerful, but also exploring the ways in which she wants to be bad or naughty. And that is exhibited in all children's doll play. And identity play doesn't stop with children. When we dress up for carnival, when we assume a different identity on a website, we continue to play with our identity right throughout our lives. Freedom of effort is simply the freedom to play hard or to play in a relaxed way, and to move fluidly between hard play and easy play. We all do that all the time. If we were playing and someone was standing over our shoulder saying, play harder, the fun would stop and we would stop playing. So all these freedoms are necessary for play to be meaningful experiences. The challenge is that no 2 people play the same. I guess that you can't, the player's motivations are entirely intrinsic and personal, which is really a challenge in play. So how do we channel play into meaning? How can we as sort of helpful adults channel play into meaningful activities while still allowing for play's fundamentally open-ended nature? And I think that's where games come in. And to illustrate the power of games, I actually want to use what I think of as a kind of ridiculous example of golf, which to those of us who don't play golf, golf seems like a silly game, much like tic-tac-toe. I mean, with golf, you are hitting a very small ball with a very long stick. It's very hard. At first, when you start to do it, you miss entirely. You eventually start hitting the ball maybe 10 feet, maybe 15 feet, but not very far. Eventually, you can hit it far enough to play on a golf course, but you still frequently don't. It doesn't go where you intended. It goes in the water. It goes in the woods. You lose a golf ball. It costs $2.50 every time you lose a golf ball. It's a miserable experience. In fact, the great American humorist Mark Twain described golf as a long walk spoiled. And yet, there are people who love golf. In fact, it tends to be CEOs and politicians and presidents and businessmen, people who can bill their time out at $1,000 an hour, will waste 4 hours on the golf course doing what? Moving a ball from one place to another in the hardest way possible. Golf would be so much easier if you just picked up the ball, walked to the end of the course, and dropped the ball in the hole. But nobody plays golf that way. Everybody plays golf in the hardest way possible by moving, by trying to hit the little ball with a long stick. And And yet, so why do they do that? Well, the great game scholar, Bernard Suits, has this definition of a game. A game is the voluntary overcoming of unnecessary obstacles. I want to take that apart. The voluntary overcoming of unnecessary obstacles. So first of all, it's voluntary. A game is only a game if you're free to play it or not play it. It's also unnecessary. Games are never life and death if they're real games. So when you're out playing golf or any other game, the future of the world isn't at stake. The future of your children aren't at stake. By definition, games are voluntary and unnecessary. But the other two words there are the most important: overcoming obstacles. When we are presented with an obstacle, whether it's a golf course or a tic-tac-toe board or any other game, there is something in us that rises to that challenge, that makes us want to play the game. And in the pursuit of that game, we will become quite strategic. We'll play quite hard. We'll tend to have a good time. We'll accept failure. What is golf, or tic-tac-toe again, for that matter, if not sort of regular failure? And yet we like to play games, even if a simple thing like a board game like chess. If you're evenly matched, there's a 50% chance you're not going to win. You're going to fail. Same thing with tennis. And yet we are willing to do it because we are naturally rise to the challenge. In games, we willingly submit to arbitrary rules and structures in pursuit of mastery. Mastery is what's so critical to us. We really want to get better at things, but only if we can continue to be playful. It's critical that games allow those 4 freedoms of play so that we can enjoy them. Otherwise, they just become labor. And so games are a powerful way of helping shape human experience. But games aren't the only way we play. Another way that we play is by seeking stories. These children are all playing, in a sense, listening to the storyteller, are all playing. And this is a childlike version, but when we go to the movies, when we watch television, when we go to an art gallery, when we listen to a musical performance, in all of those, we are sort of doing the same thing that these children are doing, listening to stories. We are sort of seeking out other kinds of experience. And then, of course, sometimes play looks like this. It looks like just messing around. It looks like sort of free, inventive play. It isn't a game because there's no rules. There's not a story necessarily, but there is still play. And so, as the title of my talk mentions, I talk about stories, games, and just messing around. And they're all forms of play. I've been thinking a long time about this and the roles that we take as players, as people playing. And I want to talk about sort of the 3 roles that we play that are involved in playing. The contestant is sort of my way of saying when we play a game. And when we play a game, we sort of bend all our energy toward playing that game. That's what I've been implying with my examples of tic-tac-toe and golf. That we sort of accept, we sort of we block out everything else, and we really largely put our attention to just playing a game. Spectator is not a very elegant word, but it's the word I use for when we listen to stories, when we go to movies, when we go to the museum, or when we listen to music, when we are sort of in some way taking in the performance or the story of somebody else. Also, when we watch sports, we can be watching the performance of an athlete. And the third role is as creator. That's where the messing around part comes in, where we're inventing. We're inventing things whether it's art or whether it's just building a sand castle. In either case, we're being a creator. Now, these are not, in fact, these are all, as I'm saying, forms of play. They're not actually distinct categories. They're not like separate categories which can only be one or the other. They're in fact poles, that you think of them as sort of different poles within the space of play. But in fact, you can be sort of anywhere along a sort of 3-dimensional spectrum. So let me just give you a few examples. When you're playing a game, you're a contestant. But at the same time, if you're inventing new strategies as you're playing that game, you're a creator. I mean, if you watched the Pele or Michael Jordan, you know that you're seeing a new creation, new invention, almost art occurring all the time. You're also on some level a spectator. You're sort of remembering past performances. You're watching other people play. You're drawing energy from the way other people play. So even as you're a contestant, you're also playing those two roles. Similarly, as a spectator, if you're watching an sporting event, you get very engaged in it. You almost feel as if you're playing the game. You're also a creator. So when most of us watch a team sport, we root for our team, and we sort of invent new story. We invent our own narrative about it. So we sort of say our team are the good guys and they're the bad guys. And everything that happens in the game, we sort of turn into a story about good versus evil. So we are sort of creating stories as we're spectators. And similarly, as an artist, of course, as a creator, you're also a contestant because you're always playing against the rules of your medium. If you're a painter, you've got to work with the rules of painting, of composition, of how paint works, of what's going to actually stay on the canvas. Or if you're a musician, you have to observe certain fundamental rules of how music plays. Not that you can't break the rules. Some of the creativity comes in breaking the rules, but you're always breaking those rules carefully and sort of you're always working in relationship to those rules. So you're kind of a contestant. And you're also kind of a spectator because you're always sort of responding to the art of earlier creators. So as I say, these are not totally distinct roles, but they are sort of poles. So an athlete is largely a contestant. An artist is largely a creator. When we go to the movie, we're largely a spectator, even as we move across these. What's interesting to me is how with new technology, these ideas are blending even more. And I specifically here want to talk about the distinction between contestant and spectator. For most of human history, games and sports were quite distinct from storytelling. They were both things that mattered to us. We've been telling stories probably as long as we've been human. We know that we've been playing games as long as we've been human, but we can sort of see them as largely separate domains. Not that they never crossed each other. And in my last slide, I sort of suggested we're always doing a little bit of each. But games and stories were very separate through much of human culture. What's interesting to me is the way that's begun to change with the rise of electronic and digital media. And if we think about, let me go back. I know I'm guessing many people in this audience aren't old enough to have played the original Donkey Kong, but this is the game that got me hooked on digital games. Because I'm older than you. And as you can see, the original version, the version that I played was quite crude. And digital games before this were mostly just dots on screens, like Pong. You were just shooting at geometric objects. But here with Donkey Kong, suddenly we're looking, even in these crude graphics, we can imagine a story. The character who was going to become Mario, even in this crude version, we sort of had a sense maybe he's a plumber. And that even though we don't really see a building here, we imagine we're in a building. And of course, we all know King Kong, and so seeing the giant gorilla and the woman on the top immediately tells us a story that we imagine she's been captured by the gorilla, and we're going to save her. So even with very crude graphics, games were suddenly starting to engage us in story. And I would argue that Donkey Kong was more fun because I could imagine that story. If it had just been a game of jumping at dots on screens and bouncing up and down, I wouldn't have enjoyed it as much because the game was beginning to engage me, not just as a contestant, but as a spectator. And of course, games have come a very long way. So I'm going to move from Donkey Kong to what I think is one of the great video games of all time, Shadow of the Colossus, which I think really points in the direction of how games and stories are successfully merging. Now, of course, from Donkey Kong on, video games have used story. But I would argue many video games from Donkey Kong, even to the present day, sort of you have this form. You play a game for a little bit, like you solve a puzzle. Obviously, you're seeing a human character or an avatar, but you're largely working on trying to figure out how to jump over something or how to shoot something. You're playing very game-like activities. And then it stops for a moment, and then you get a bit of story. So your character suddenly advances to the next level, you get another piece of story, and then you play another game. So the typical video game, even in the present day, is game, story, game, story. The story does help motivate the gameplay, but the story and the game are still distinct. What I love about Shadow of the Colossus is that Shadow of the Colossus it's very much a game. It's a very much a puzzle-solving game, but it also takes a story that is about a character trying to solve a problem, somewhat obsessively. And what it in effect does is it gets you to identify with that character, that his obsession in the story matches your obsession as a game player. And at the end of the game, when you learn, if you don't know the game, the premise is that you are this young prince, your true love, a princess, her soul has been captured and it's been distributed into the bodies of these giant creatures. And you have to go and hunt them all down and kill them to free her soul. Partway through the game, what you realize, though, you start to realize that these creatures are innocent, that they're simply existing in their world and that you're the invader, you're killing them. But of course, as a game player, your obsession with the game, you tend to keep playing. Even as you know you're killing these innocent creatures, you keep playing. And so the game gets you to start identifying with the hero's own obsession. And at the end of the game, when you learn that that obsession was actually tragic, that he has been destroyed by his obsession, because you've identified with him through your own sort of obsessive behavior, you understand that story so much more. You've truly lived in the story. You haven't just played a game, watched a story. You've actually played inside the story of the game. And there are other games that I think do this too. Red Dead Redemption, I think, recognizes the way in which a lot of gameplay sort of has the feeling of the Wild West, of sort of there are no rules, of everybody making up their own rules. And similarly, it also engages you in a tragic story in which the absence of rules actually contributes to the tragedy of the character, sort of the Wild West atmosphere. So similar to Shadow of the Colossus. Now, since these games, other games have come that I think have gone even further in terms of blending narrative and story. Dear Esther is a game in which you wander around an environment. It's one of the first games of a genre that are now frequently called walking simulations. But in Dear Esther, you wander through this beautiful environment, you find objects. The game never tells you what to do with these objects or what they mean. And so as you find these objects, you are sort of creating your own story. I would argue that in the formal sense, Dear Esther may not be a game because there may not be a real finished goal or win state. But I think everyone who plays it makes it their own kind of game because they each try to come up with their own way of making sense of the objects and the documents that they find. And so they're also, of course, making a game, but they're also making a story as they go. So again, they're a creator, they're a spectator, they're a contestant, all at the same time. Gone Home is a little closer, I think, to the form of a game because in this one you enter a house, you are the story, you're a girl coming home, you've been away for a long while, and suddenly your family is gone, you don't know why. And you have to piece together the story from the objects you find. So in this one, you're solving a real mystery. And so in a sense that you have a win state, this is a real game because you win when you sort of feel you've solved the problem. But again, you're also sort of making up a story as you go. So this is a form. So this is a way in which digital games can sort of truly sort of come closer to blending with sort of more deeply with both storytelling, creation, and story watching, sort of being a spectator. Now, on some level, this has been going on for a long time in print. When we read a mystery novel, in fact, we obviously, as I'm arguing, when we read a book, we're sort of a spectator. But what a mystery novel does is it presents us with clues. And so we can turn it into a game. We don't have to. We can just read the mystery and wait and let the author tell us what's happening. But many of us, when we read a mystery, we try to figure out in advance before the author tells us what's actually going on. And so we've sort of turned it into a game. And if we guess the mystery, we think we won. If we don't, we maybe think we've lost. So we turn it into a game, even though it's never explicitly called a game. But still, in a misreading a book, we're more spectator than contestant. But as I say, it sort of gives you a sense of the direction that these forms can go in. Interestingly enough, around the same time that video games were being invented, and I didn't include a slide of this, Dungeons and Dragons was being invented. And so Dungeons and Dragons is really a game in which you are inventing a story as you play the game. And it wasn't even digital. And I think on some level, this happens in culture all the time, we sometimes invent new forms that predict other new forms that are going to come down the road. And so the invention of Dungeons and Dragons in 1978, on some level, begins to anticipate what video games are going to be. Just as if you go back to the 19th century, in theater in the 19th century had all sorts of tremendous spectacle that in some ways anticipated the arrival of movies, of motion pictures. So this idea of story and game was anticipated even before video games ushered it in, but of course it's moved much more quickly with video games than it did in the past. But it's also happening on the other side of the coin. It's happening in the theater. This is a picture from a play, a performance that's now happening. It's been playing in New York for many years now. It's called Sleep No More. Now, if you look at this picture, the two people in the foreground are the actors. The people wearing the masks are all the audience members. When you enter the theater, you're given a mask to wear to make it clear that you're not a performer. And this play is actually taking place in a very large space in many rooms, all at the same time. And the audience is free to wander from room to room, and nobody tells you where to go. And so everybody who comes to it wanders through the space trying to figure out what's going on, trying to make sense of it, trying to see as much action as they can. And usually, they're also usually separated. They do some clever things to separate you from the party you arrive with. So when you walk out of the theater at the end of the night, you start comparing notes and discovering that somebody saw something you didn't see, and that makes you want to go back. And on some level, this play, it is a performance, but it also has many of the qualities of a video game, of where you're trying to discover what's going on in the game. You go back many times to try to clear the game, to try to see all the different parts of the game. And so here's a case where you are definitely a spectator, but you really become as much a contestant in the process. So again, so not just the world of video games, but also the world of theater, of interactive theater, is now creating newer, more interesting ways in which we can sort of blend these different forms of play together. There are still other forms that I'd like to introduce. I want to talk about a project that we did at MIT that I think might suggest even other ways that one might go with this. This is also still primarily a game, but it's not a traditional video game. It was called Vanished, and it was done a number of years ago, but we announced in advance in the press, we announced that there was going to be something called Vanished, and it was called the MIT Smithsonian Science Game. Smithsonian is United States National Museum, so I don't know how familiar that name is in Brazil, but it would be familiar to most Americans. And so the idea that MIT and our National Museum were doing a game together would interest some kids. And it was open to kids ages 11 to 14. So you signed up in advance to play Vanished, and you got, as soon as you signed up, you got a video. You saw 3 students from MIT, and they were real MIT students on video saying, "Thanks for signing up. The game is going to start on April 4th. Please show up at noon on April 4th, and that's when the game will begin." And so about 3,000 kids all over the world had signed up for the game before April 4th. And when they showed up on April 4th, they got another video of the same 3 kids. This is just a still image. But you can see that the video was somewhat degraded. It was not a high quality video. And the first one had been, but this one wasn't. And the students say, "We have bad news. Somebody hacked our site. The game we'd planned is down. We don't know what to do. We can't figure it out. We need your help. We set up an internet forum. Please go on the forum and help us figure out what to do about our game." So all of the kids who'd signed up to play the game went onto the forum and started talking to each other. And some of them said, "On that video, did you notice that there were letters flashing on the screen?" Now, there's not in this image, so you don't go looking for it, but there were when the video played live. And some kids had noticed them and some hadn't. They all went back and looked, and they all discovered they had letters on their screen, but they all had different letters. And so after about 2 hours, the kids all figured out, they had a guess that the letters didn't make any sense. They were just a string of looked like random letters, but they all had a guess that maybe it was a code. And then about an hour later, one of the kids found a website, and not one we created, one that was actually out in the web, where they could decode their strings of letters. And so kids started decoding their letters, and they each found that they had little bits of a message, like a word and a half of a message. And in fact, there were 100 different fragments among all the players. So then the MIT students said, okay, we created an app. So they created an app where they could all sort of put their different fragments together. And it took them 2 days to put the pieces together, but they eventually got a message which said, if you crack the code, you're the people we need. We're contacting you from the future, your future, our present. We need your help solving a mystery. Sometime between your time and our time, a catastrophe occurred worldwide, and it wiped out the historical record. So we don't know what happened, and we need your help piecing it together. And this started the players of the game Vanished down an 8-week-long hunt, solving a series of mysteries. We called it a curated game because as they did it, they worked with curators at the Smithsonian Institution. They solved a series of very interesting and difficult scientific problems, one after another, and each problem led to another problem. And while they were solving them about once a week, they got to talk online to a scientist. They dealt with problems having to do with geology, with volcanoes, with forensic anthropology, with bones, with paleobotany, the botany of the dinosaur world. They solved increasingly complex problems on the route to solving this mystery. They also, in the course of it, kids were actually encouraged in certain parts of the country to go out to local museums and collect data. Kids were collecting data about the animals that lived in their backyards. It was all feeding into this game. Now, very early in the game, some kids started saying, wait a minute, this isn't real. And all the other kids would write back and say, yeah, of course we know that, but just keep playing. So the kids knew, we never said this is the game, but of course kids knew it was the game. And in the interest of that game, they did significant, difficult scientific challenges. They did really hard, interesting scientific work. And they did it all for the sake of playing the game. Now, about halfway through the game, one of our players was very clever, and he looked at the URLs for the information that the game was slowly feeding the kids, and he noticed a pattern to those URLs, and he managed to figure out how to download all the information that the game was going to give. In effect, he solved the problem of the game about halfway through. And he posted a message on the forum saying that he'd solved it. Because we moderated it, we caught that message before it got to everybody, and we asked him, would you be willing to withhold the information and let everybody play to the end? And he said yes, but we also let him tell everybody that he'd done it, and we gave him 1,000 points. And so he announced to everybody that he'd actually solved it, but that he wasn't going to share that. And everybody said, good, let's keep playing. So now if you think about it, what I said about games before, about the point that games are really about overcoming obstacles. And these kids were all playing together. So theoretically, when he solved it, they all won. They could have just said, yes, we won, and sort of shared in the victory. But instead, they wanted to keep playing the game. In effect, they wanted to keep living in the story of the game. Because in the story of the game, these kids were helping people from the future solve difficult scientific problems. They were being scientists themselves. And we know from the things that the kids posted online that their identity actually changed, that they began to see themselves as being capable scientists. So through their gameplay, through the combination of gameplay and story, this is another image just of some of the things they did. I should have shown that earlier. But through the process of just gameplay and story, what I call imaginative projection occurred. They imaginatively projected themselves into the world of the game and into the story of the game. And in the process, they actually became, they saw themselves as scientists. They really saw a change in themselves. And I think, we all have experiences growing up. For some of us, it might be that we practiced at football and we got good at it, and so that changed our view of ourselves. It might be that we read a story about somebody and we decided we wanted to grow up to be like them. It might be that we saw a movie and decided we wanted to make movies, or we wanted to be like a character in the movie. And so through all of our play, we are really sort of creating our identity. And the power that I think these new blended forms have is of being even more powerful tools for changing the ways that we all see ourselves, the ways that we imagine our place in the world. That by the combination of rising to the challenge that a game gives us, by engaging in the invention that stories provide to us, by the creative just messing around that we all do together, all of these forms of play actually help us become better people, whether it's better at our future careers, or just better artists, or just better human beings. That's going to come through our play. And by inventing these new forms, I think we're only going to accelerate the ways in which children's play can actually help them grow up to be the best human beings that they can possibly be. And so I thank you for your attention to my talk. I hope that this form of delivery isn't too difficult or tedious, and I look forward to answering your questions. Thanks very much.
Muito obrigado, professor Scott. Thank you very much. Foi uma palestra tão interessante, instigante, com vários temas super aprofundados aí da temática de jogos. Teremos agora um momento para perguntas e respostas. Para entrar nesse novo momento, a gente pede a todos os participantes que cliquem no link que está aqui na descrição desse vídeo, no chat, para poder abrir um novo vídeo onde nós estaremos ao vivo com o professor Scott e onde poderemos fazer as perguntas. Peço a todos que façam as perguntas em inglês, se possível, que nós vamos repassar elas para o professor, tá bom? Então, cliquem no link e a gente se vê ao vivo no outro vídeo.